Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Daily Friend Show. I'm your host, Nicholas Lorimer, and I'm joined today by Ms. Sara Gon. Sara, how are you doing?
Well, thank you, Nick. Thank you. And you?
I am very well, thank you. I also hadn't turned off my fan. I hope you couldn't hear that. And I'm also joined today by Mr. Marius Roodt. Marius, how are you, sir?
How's Nick? How's Sara?
How's Marius?
Right. So, of course, we are, for those watching live, a bit early today on the show because we are once again blessed with the wonders of load shedding. But we talked about that enough this week. So I think what we're going to do is go on to our first story today. And a lot of our stories today are going to focus a little bit about the world outside SA, although this one, of course, has to do with us. And this is the increasing push towards integration between Africa's economies and political systems. Everyone in Africa has basically at some point at least given some lip service to the idea of Pan-African, African Union, African cooperation, that kind of stuff. But we've actually seen some developments in recent years which suggest that there are some more concrete plans towards regional integration. One of these is that the African Free Trade Agreement was signed by a large number of African countries, although there are some that are still holding out on it, some of the more closed economies. And the idea of this is to lower sort of all tariff barriers across Africa. Now, some people fear that this will cause enormous economic disruption, that, like, for example, tons of people will either flood to South Africa or South African industries will go to other African countries, and that this will ultimately not be good for people. I don't necessarily buy those arguments that much, but I think it's also kind of a moot point. While I think the African Free Trade Agreement probably is pretty good, I think so far it seems pretty typical of a lot of these kind of big initiatives in the African continent, where everyone agrees to something, everyone signs something on paper, and then you get to the border and the officials there will shake you down for money and basically charge you the tariff anyway if you try to cross it. And I think that's a problem that's not going to go away anytime soon. So I think that in practical terms, the African Free Trade Agreement is probably not going to come to effect. But why am I talking about this? Well, Naledi Pandor, our Minister of International Relations and Cooperation, was speaking at a function with sort of EU stuff. She was talking, about AU stuff. She was talking about the African Free Trade Agreement. And she also went on to talk about how there should be greater integration across Africa, particularly with regards to its economies. African Central Bank should be a long-term objective. And of course, that she said it a little bit weirdly, she said the suggestion that South Africa is not advocating for creating a single currency on the continent is incorrect. So what she means is South Africa is advocating for a single currency on the continent. So I've thrown out a bunch of stuff here. Let's start with you, Marius. What do you make of the idea of, I don't know, what would we call our currency? The euro is called the euro. Would we call it the Africa dollar, the Afro, whatever?
The Afro. I think they at the moment they talk about the ACU, the African Currency Unit, I think, but I'm sure it'll come up with some nifty name. But just on the point of the African Free Trade Area, it's actually something that South Africa needs to look at our trade with Africa. Because if you break down our trade partners, what we trade with Europe and North America and China and so on, it's basically raw materials. You know, we export platinum or palladium or gold or whatever it is to them, and then we import finished goods. But if you look at what we trade with the rest of the continent, nearly all what we export to the rest of the continent is finished goods, whether, it's white goods or cars or whatever the case is. So that's actually something we need to look at. That is where, it would be an easy win. That's something we increase our trade with other African countries where we export finished goods to them. And I'm open to correction, but last time I looked, SADC, we were the biggest trading partner for the whole of SADC. I think each SADC country, South Africa was the biggest trading partner.
And also, while Africa remains quite poor, it is getting richer in most places. Some notable exceptions like DRC and Central African Republic. But also that Africa's population is going to become much, much larger, especially relative to the rest of the world. in the coming decades. So the potential market, if at least some African countries get their act together, is going to be quite something. Sara, what do you make of all of these efforts? Sorry, go ahead, Marius.
Yeah, I was going to say, when we look, if 10 or 20% of the continent is what we could call middle class, that's a market of 250 million people. And if as you say, if the continent gets their act together and the continent gets richer, then there'll be more people to sell. So obviously that's something we want to, we don't want people living in poverty and being unemployed, but yeah, it's up to African countries. They're the only ones who can really save themselves. So Africa is including that.
And we wouldn't have the same immigration problems if the rest of Africa wasn't such a basket case.
Exactly.
Sorry, I interrupted you. You were about to say.
No, I was essentially going to pick up on exactly that point, and that is that, you've got the European Union, which is not without its problems, but it's relatively economically stable. Although even there, you've got the sort of the rich north and the struggling south. I think the problem with Africa is, to treat it as a block, given how disparate the politics and the level of development is within countries in Africa, it can be very stark, and it's in that respect that I think an African block, an African currency, to try and institute something across Africa, pretty much sort of in one go, as if I think you really would have to look at relatively similarly developed economies, creating a block, and then adding in countries as they democratize, as they grow, which would mean more free market societies. So, as you say, the market is the potential is huge, but I think to try and sort of keep looking at everything on an Africa-wide basis, Africa is just not. It's not a single block. It's not, the countries are not the same. The cultures are not the same, etc., etc. So I think, I don't know, not enough of an economics expert, but concentrating on a SADC block made sense. And it would make sense to go up and create the equivalent of an EU with certain countries. But I think to try and make it Africa-wide, countries like Mali or Sudan or South Sudan, the idea of a single currency across that sort of disparity strikes me as, perhaps wishful thinking.
And
no,
then
I agree.
There's sorry, yeah, carry on.
And there are these regional blocks. There's a big Western African one, which I think does have a single currency. There's, of course, SADC, which has this currency union of sorts. But those haven't really gotten to where I think they need to be before you can start. This is once again a very good example of policymakers trying to run before they can walk, kind of thing. It's like, and we're seeing, the progress, or there has been a lot of progress in Africa since the 90s, and I think people don't realize that often. Everything from education levels to infant mortality to levels of wealth to unemployment, etc. There have still been some serious reverses. Mali had a coup recently, setting back its government to how it kind of was in like the 80s. Marius, go ahead.
But I just want to point out that even with countries that are on similar levels of development, even sharing currency can be a problem. I was speaking to a Namibian economist a little while ago, and for people who don't know that are listening, the common monetary area is basically South Africa, Lesotho, Eswatini, and Namibia, where they use their own currencies, but that's pegged at 1-to-1 to the rand, and the rand is legal tender in those countries. So this Namibian economist was telling me the Namibian dollar is actually a bit of a problem. It's about 20% overvalued. So it makes Namibian imports too expensive. It makes exports too cheap, and that's actually a big problem for the Namibian economy. They actually need to be able to float the currency, but they can't do that at the moment because it's linked to the rand. They have their own central bank, but all it does is basically mimic what our central bank's doing, because they can't really do too much. So even where there's two countries on similar levels of development as South Africa and Namibia are, quite strong historical ties. It was obviously a colony of South Africa for many years. Lots similar, similar history and similar political culture and so on. Even then, it doesn't really. There are big problems with it. So I don't see kind of African wide currency working. And as Sara pointed out, you take a country like, say, Kenya and South Sudan. They're even in the same region, broadly speaking, but the very different levels of development, and it's not really practical for them to have a single currency. And as I say, even here in Southern Africa, where there's Namibia and South Africa, which are pretty similar levels of development, even the fact that we have a single currency is maybe not the greatest idea.
Right. So, I mean, I think ultimately one of the big problems here is that a lot of the ideals behind the African Union, behind kind of Pan-Africanism, are simply essentially rooted in a kind of racial nationalism. It's the idea that all Black people must be in the same political unit or the same economic unit or something. And as long as that remains the underlying principle behind a lot of these kind of Pan-Africanist initiatives, instead of thinking about this as a kind of regional integration thing, as a proximity thing, as a sort of shared political values thing, it's never going to work. It's always going to be a bit of a disaster.
I think that's the difference with Europe and Africa. Europe has got at least some kind of shared cultures in terms of Christianity.
Well, it helps that it's much smaller.
Yeah, and it's got a shared culture in Christianity, basically, which we don't have in Africa. I mean, we have Islam dominates a lot of the continent compared to Christianity, and you've got other religions as well, animism and so on, ancestor worship and all that kind of thing. And obviously and as you say, the EU's got, 400 million people. Africa by itself has got 1.2 billion. So any kind of, pretty tight political and economic union which you have in the EU is, it's got much fewer hurdles to cross than anything.
Right, and it's not like there aren't major disagreements in Europe.
Exactly.
So you can only imagine what Africa would be like. Sara, final thoughts?
Just to say that I wonder about, I may be wrong, but I wonder about the fact that a resentment could be created by the Kenyas and the South Africas being seen as dominant players, as the more successful players, and because
let me completely confirm that. I went to a workshop hosted by the Frederick Naumann Foundation in South Africa, promoting the African Free Trade Area, and it had MPs there from a lot of the smaller countries, and all of them were absolutely terrified that South Africa and Kenya and such would just dominate them.
Yeah. Like
Sorry, I interrupted you there. Right.
And I mean, we've seen there'll be rivalry between the big countries. I know within the African Union, there's a very big rivalry between South Africa and Nigeria, and there's kind of two blocks that have sort of coalesced. I mean, we saw there was a competition between Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma when she became the chairperson of the AU Commission, and she was up against. I don't think he was a Nigerian guy, but he was from West Africa and backed by the Nigerians, if I recall correctly.
Yeah, I think he was a francophone.
Yeah, and then the poor AU Commission got stuck with NDZ. So, but then they got rid of her and she had to come back out, which maybe that's
so we stuck with it.
Yeah, maybe it would have been better if she stayed. Okay. All right, let's move on to our next topic. And of course, we've occasionally followed on the show that Minister Bathabile Dlamini was, or at least senior ANC figure, Minister, Bathabile Dlamini has been charged with perjury, and she has now been found guilty that she in fact lied under oath. Sara, can you take us through a little bit about what exactly is going on here?
Yeah. If you remember the debacle with SASSA in 2017-18, when grants weren't being paid, it became an absolute, almost a humanitarian crisis. And there was an inquiry into that debacle, and she made statements under oath at that inquiry that have been found. They were challenged, and she was charged with perjury, and it has ended up in court before a magistrate. It's not often that you see something like a charge for perjury actually playing out in the public sphere, but basically because she was lying. So she's now been she's been found guilty of perjury by the magistrate. She's still awaiting sentencing, and of course the prosecutor is seeking something that would at least include imprisonment. I'm not sure if they'll quite go for that, but yeah. I remember that. Yeah. I mean, she was I think the same time she was minister was when she was the head of the ANC Women's League, and Butterfield Dlamini was just one of those people who never struck one as being the sort of person one would want as a leader, being competent, tactical, thoughtful. None of those things. She's a very, very rough diamond, and apparently now there's now a debate over what her role should be in the ANC Women's League. Now that to me raises two interesting questions. The one is, does the ANC's Women's League still exist? I mean, I know it does, but it's lost authority. It's plummeted, and invariably when it comes out and says something, it's wrong. It's on the wrong side of history. It's on the wrong side of humanity. It's just wrong all around. And the other thing is, it again comes back to the whole thing about, the ANC, when someone is charged, we'll look at stepping aside, blah, blah, blah. She's been found guilty of perjury. She held a very, she was in cabinet. I don't think that there should be any discussion about her role in the ANC Women's League. And the fact that there says bad things about the ANC, and probably worst thing about the Women's League, that there isn't, that she's even in contention for possible election to a high position in the Women's League, when, she can belong to the Women's League, but she should really be out in the cold. There should be some consequences even at that level. I mean, I still find it funny that I see that Daily Maverick, in doing an article about that, has featured that funny photograph of her turned upside down. It probably says more about the issue than I could say, and more eloquently. But it goes to the Achilles heel of the ANC, that it doesn't do anything about its errant members, and that seeps through into the whole philosophy of the party, the state capture, the BEE, the cadre deployment. So, but she may get in simply because the ANC actually doesn't care about the Women's League anymore.
Does seem like it. Marius, when I sent the story to you, you simply replied to me with the emoji of someone yawning. Why did you reply with that?
Because it's kind of a usual thing. ANC, somebody who's quite senior in the ANC has been found guilty of something pretty bad. Nothing's going to happen. They're going to pay lip service to it. And I mean, just on Butterfield Dlamini, we've seen her come out in support of her. They're some of the worst people, not only in the ANC, but in the country. People like Tony Ngeni, Andile Lungisa, Carl Nias. And I think Ace Magashule probably, I wouldn't be surprised. And I think there's also a telling thing that happened in 2017, and just showed you the lip service that is paid to, she was in the Women's League, and it's about women's empowerment and so on. So after the 2017 conference, when Cyril Ramaphosa beat Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma, she said no, but she was supporting Dlamini Zuma, and the Women's League was also supporting Dlamini Zuma because they, need a woman to be in charge of the ANC. And the journalist speaking to her said, "So does that mean you voted for Lindiwe Sisulu as deputy president?" And then Butterfield Dlamini refused to answer the question. So it obviously wasn't just say you voted for Dlamini Zuma because of whatever reason. It wasn't about because she's a woman. It's complete nonsense. If they were true, you would vote for Lindiwe Sisulu as the deputy, but she didn't. So it just shows you, it's just all this, people use women's empowerment and whatever. It's just as a fig leaf. And, because obviously everybody thinks women's empowerment's a great thing. Obviously, you don't want to stand against it. But these people don't really believe in that kind of thing. It's all just to try to get to power and whatever.
Yeah, no, it depends on the woman, and it depends on the provision of secure financial futures.
Exactly.
Very well put. All right, so let's move now back overseas. I think we should talk about South Korea's elections. So South Korea, very important country in the world, biggest shipbuilding country in the world, or most educated country in the world, I believe, in terms of how many people have what percentage of the population have tertiary education. And of course, as we've said many times before, a country which shows South Africa a potential way that things can go if you do some things right. You don't even have to get everything right. Well, we talked a little bit about how there was a little bit of election violence in the lead up to the presidential election in South Korea. And it seems as though a lot of people in South Korea have been a little bit unhappy with both candidates. Neither of them was super popular, but we do have a result now from that presidential election, and it looks like the government has lost. The left-wing party, the Social Democrats, have lost control of the presidency, And the incoming president is a guy called Yoon Suk Yeol, who is, I would say, by the standards of much of the world, much of the sort of free world today, pretty right-wing in the sense that he's very in favor of economic freedom. He just described himself as a very big fan of Milton Friedman. He doesn't like minimum wages. He doesn't like over-regulation. He's also very in favor of taking a hard line against North Korea. He's in favor, for example, of the US hosting at least small numbers of nuclear weapons in South Korea to help protect them against North Korea's growing nuclear arsenal. And this is a bit of a setback for South Korea's left, who have taken a much more conciliatory approach to North Korea in recent years, which I don't think has really paid off. But so he doesn't have control of the legislature, so I'm sure whatever he does next will be probably quite limited. Although I'm no expert on South Korean politics by any means. But Marius, let me start with you. What do you make of this election? Anything that sticks out to you?
There's a couple of interesting things. Apparently, this guy's Mr. Jun or Yun, however you say his name, was his victory was because a lot of young people who, and this is a phenomenon around the world, generally vote for your left-wing parties, your left-of-center parties. Apparently, there was a very big swing away from the left towards the right amongst young people, especially young men. And I was reading an exit poll, apparently an exit poll in Seoul, capital of South Korea. 72% of, I think, men aged between 20 and 30 voted for Mr. Jun. So it shows you there was a big swing away from that, away from left-wing parties. And also there's something that's interesting about him is, as far as I can tell, he's the first South Korean president that was born after the end of the Korean War. So he's maybe also, he might have a different view of North Korea, might be a bit less conciliatory. Might be, as you say, he's a bit more bombastic about South Korea. And we'll have to see what happens. He seems like an interesting guy. Said that there should food standards should be taken away from food, because if poor people want to eat cheap food that's bad for them, that should be their decision. And so things like that.
Where's the problem, Marius?
And so he should abolish the minimum wage, and he thinks women's rights are a load of nonsense. So he's
I think he was endorsed by the head of the Anti-Feminist League or something in South Korea. Yeah. Although feminism in South Korea and Japan does not have the same cachet it has in other democracies.
Yeah. So, and maybe those societies are a little bit more conservative than Western societies. Maybe there is still a need for maybe women are still discriminated in a way. I'm not too familiar with the situation there, but overall he seems like quite an interesting guy. But the fact that he's, he seems to have quite a belligerent foreign policy to North Korea and China. This could, it's things are looking already a bit fruity around the world, and looks like there could be another flashpoint now in Korea where, in the 90s, things seem to be, a lot of people thought we were going to be heading for a second Korean War in the 90s, but things seem to calm down a bit. Bill Clinton, and I think that six powers arrangement between the Koreas, the US, Japan,
don't get me started on
Russia,
that.
China. But anyway, it seemed to bring things a bit more calm to the Korean Peninsula. But maybe things are going to be a bit different now. And also, maybe, as I say, South Koreans, I think probably a couple of a generation or two ago, South Koreans did see North Koreans as kind of a fraternal country. But I think maybe things now are a bit different. I mean, they've been separate now for nearly 80 years. They've been obviously very different political systems, not much communication between the two countries. I think some kind of German style reunification eventually is probably out of the question, actually, in Korea.
Yeah, and I must say that, as South Korea looks across the sea towards Taiwan and sees them being menaced by China, I'm sure there are some people in South Korea who are thinking to themselves, we can't afford to take a soft line right now because the world is, as you say, looking a little bit fruity. Sarah, your thoughts?
Yeah, I'm if the sort of world environment and security played a role, which I'm sure it did, that sort of might have tipped it over the edge. It's understandable, and taking a tougher line, I think, is also understandable, because this election has taken place in the midst of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and I don't necessarily imagine the South Koreans would have too much reassurance about the support it would get from its allies. But as you say, having taken a relatively soft stance with a sort of potential view into the future of some sort of unification, I think you probably are dealing with a generation, if it's post the Korean War, that just doesn't see it. That nexus just isn't felt to the same extent by this generation. Interesting about the support from young men. Maybe they like his anti-feminist stance. Maybe they're feeling a bit emasculated, but the idea of having got rid of the left and supplanting with ideas of free market economics and a generally more democratic economic regime. That may have been attractive to the younger generation. And as I say, I think that the attraction of an economic improvement would probably mean more than the emotional attachment to any potential or not really potential relationship with North Korea. And also, I would imagine if they're looking at the situation across the world, they're saying, like Ukraine, it may or may not work, but they certainly have to be sure that they are better prepared for anything that comes than just relying on their allies. So that would go with the right-wingism.
South Korea does actually have quite a large army because it's constantly sort of standing off with the North, quite a large and well-equipped army. So they are not to be lightly messed with. Yeah, it's an interesting point about the feminism one. And I do wonder, so like I said, I don't really understand South Korean politics that well, but I know that there are at least some people on the sort of right in Europe and North America who look towards Asian culture increasingly as something that's much more fun, much more open, because we've seen this closing of the kind of European, North American cultural mind over the past couple of years. There's been, for example, like every time there's an advert now with a woman in skimpy clothing, it gets attacked as being sexist or something like that. Whereas that kind of stuff isn't taboo in the East. Those places are still very much kind of in favor of that sort of thing. So I wonder whether there's this similar feelings in South Korea that they feel like they need to stand up to this encroaching, stifling Western culture. Anyway, sorry, that's way too big of a topic to bring up right now. So close to the end of the show. But sorry, do you have any thoughts on what I was saying there? Just let's finish off on this one.
No, it's just sorry, no, it's just something on blank. No, I think what South Korea teaches us, less so than perhaps Ukraine, is that however successful and well prepared it is, and the point you make, it is a distinctly different culture. And I think one of the problems with global politics, particularly the politics of the West, is that it doesn't always understand the differences. It doesn't always seem to appreciate the subtleties or the cultural nuances that make an environment like Southeast Asia or the Middle East different and to be treated differently. And to some extent, they probably did the same with Russia. They probably, however knowledgeable are, invariably one gets the impression that the policymakers are not the ones who somehow get exposed to the seemingly strange, by Western terms, things that other countries can present. And it's probably a little bit felt both ways in the sense of South Korea looking after itself. But that's, as I say, I think that's an assumption that's too often made, and I wonder if it doesn't often bedevil global politics.
All right, so we don't have enough time to, I think, properly go into this last topic, but let me just very briefly introduce it, and then I'll just get Marius's 30-second thoughts on it. For a long time, Indian politics has been dominated by the Indian National Congress, who I believe in 2014 decisively lost the national leadership to the Bharatiya Janata Party, the BJP, Indian People's Party, and the ANC ever since seems to have been in a state of slow collapse. Perhaps suggesting what the ANC might look like once it loses power. But anyway, so I guess the race is on the left of the ANC to see who's going to fill that space and perhaps become a major opposition to the BJP. And there seems to be a new contender emerging. India just had a number of state elections across the country, and a party called the AAP, I can't remember their full name.
Admi Party, the Common Man Party.
The Common Man Party, has done very well in the state of Punjab, I think taking almost every single local seat. Now, Punjab is it's the 16th most populous Indian state, which means, of course, that it has a population of over 27 million people. So not anything to be sniffed at. Marius, your thoughts very briefly.
Yeah, as I say, it's maybe kind of replacing or going the vacuum that's been left by the ANC. But Indian politics is becoming increasingly fractured, and there's lots of these small little parties, especially local parties, that are emerging. And the AAP itself has been a kind of regional party. It's dominated politics in Delhi for at least 5 or 6 years, I think. So, and also what's interesting about the Punjab, or about Punjab state, is, I'm open to correction, but I think it's the only Muslim majority state in India. So, which is also interesting. But I do think, as we were saying before the show, the BJP doesn't really have any opposition on its left. So that's why it's allowed it to, it's got some fascist traits. And we've seen lots of rhetoric coming out of the BJP is actually quite worrying, especially against Muslims and some other minorities. So it's definitely something to watch out for. So, hopefully parts like the AAP or whoever else can at least threaten the BJP a bit and not let it just have this quite strong hold on power, which it does have at the moment. And India is obviously a very important country, biggest democracy in the world. And it's something that we need to, it's an important place. And we have to hope it's also a country that becomes prosperous and stays democratic.
Right. All right, that's all the time we have for today. So thank you very much for listening. We hope you enjoyed the show. Please subscribe to us. Please like the video. Please leave us reviews on whatever podcast platform you're listening to us on. And we shall see you next week for the Daily Friends Show. Cheers, everyone.